Hey folks, how are you? It is another episode of Rise Like Lions. I am Kevin, and it's just me here today. And I want to give a brief introduction to today's episode, which is a great episode. It's one I've been trying to pull together for a while now and experiencing various technical difficulties. And it's an interview with a good friend of mine, Arvind Singh. And Arvind is a bit of an expert on what has been happening over the past year in India with the farmers' protests that have swept across the country. And recently in November, we got some incredible news that it seems like the farmers have won after a year long struggle against the government changes that were attempted by Modi. So this is an interview that we've been trying to air for a little while. And I just want to give a brief introduction because the first few seconds of the interview unfortunately got cut off. And so the interview starts with Arvind talking about updates that have happened, changes that have happened to farming in India over the past few decades. So, the advent of the Green Revolution, mechanization, these sorts of things. And so that's where Arvind starts his talk. And that's where we start our interview. And then we go on and talk about the farmers' protests and what they mean for social movements today in other parts of the world. And I will say, too, there will be another part to this talk where Arvind and I want to really focus a little bit more on lessons from this protest. But this first interview is very much just about what happened in India during the past year with the farmers and the government. So thanks for checking out this episode, and hopefully we'll see you at the next one. Let's go.
It allowed for greater yield. And so that created India to be self-reliant in the decades that followed. But as the economy was opened from the 1990s and especially into the 2000s, farmers didn't receive any of the benefits. And so farmers were agitating for there to be reforms, but not the reforms that the BJP Modi government introduced. Those reforms, they're called farmer laws, but I would say that they're anti-farmer laws in the sense that they represent corporate interests, not the interests of farmers.
Okay, sorry,
And
sorry. I just want to stop you there, Arvin. Thanks, man. So that's some good history. So basically, what you're saying is that there have been issues for decades in India in
yes,
terms of, farming is starting to become a little more globalized, maybe a little more intensified in terms of technology and whatnot. And yet the farmers themselves aren't really reaping those rewards. And
yes.
so there's a grassroots movement for reforming the farm economy to help Indian farmers. And this is where I just wanted to stop, because this is, I think, a classic example of what tends to happen is governments will see an opportunity to create the changes they want to see, and they pretend that they're responding to the needs of the farmers, and they say, "Oh, we'll pass reform laws. Oh, sure, we're listening to you." And yet, like you're saying, you call them anti-farm laws, the laws that Modi just passed. So tell us about what were these reforms that Modi passed?
So there are three laws, and the laws, what the concern is that they take away the Mandi system. The Mandi system is the current system where there's a government-run market
Okay.
at the state level, and the Mandi system allows farmers to have a place where they can price their crops. And the other part of it is that the government gives a minimum price for those crops.
Yeah.
And that's really important. Not having the MSP is something that farmers have really concerned farmers. The laws don't specifically say that the MSP is being removed, the minimum sales price, but that's the fear that by opening up the farming to corporate players, they can come in and then give higher price to farmers initially, and then when the Mandi system can't compete, then farmers can't return to it because the Mandi system at that point may not exist. So
Yes.
if that isn't there and the MSP is eroded, then farmers will have no other place but to try to work with corporate players who then can kind of dictate the price of crops. And they can also dictate what what crops are grown.
Gotcha. And so I think that that's a really important thing for, I think, folks to understand, Arvind, because this is another strategy that we see all over the world, right? When there is a public institution that corporations perceive as standing in the way of their making profit, there's many different
Yes,
ways to try and undermine public institutions. A lot of times when you go at them head on and just try and get rid of them, the public pushback is so strong that the corporations have to back down. But in this sense, I think what you were saying they were trying to do was a lot sneakier. Although the farmers weren't
yes,
fooled, they were saying, "Oh, let's just open up the market," right? But like you said, what tends to happen is as soon as you allow private competition with a public institution, what starts to happen is funds start getting bled out of the public institution to the point where
exactly.
it collapses, and then all you have are the whims of the free market, right?
Free market, exactly.
Yeah, and this is probably the train that the Indian farmers saw steaming down the tracks towards
Coming
them.
at them.
Yeah.
And the other the timing of it is also when we were in the middle of the pandemic, and India was also suffering when Delta started there, and so the timing of it was, I think, intended on purpose, kind of going with the whole idea of disaster capitalism,
Yes.
in the sense that this is the time that we can shock farmers because they're not going to be prepared. We can introduce these laws, and people are already worried about health issues. They're worried about what's going on in terms of just basically surviving.
Yes.
Um, so in the middle of it, you introduce these reforms, and they're also introduced without any debate in the parliament. So opposition didn't have any input. Farmers weren't consulted at any point. So
Wow.
if these laws are intended for farmers,
Yeah.
you would think that there would be a consultative process where their needs would be addressed, but that was never done.
Yes, and
So
so
the government,
just to clarify, Arvind, so does Modi have does his party, the BJP, do they have a majority in the Indian?
yes, they do. They have a
Okay,
huge majority. So
there you go.
basically, in the parliamentary system, much like Canada, Britain, and other countries, if you have a majority, you can basically steamroll anything.
Yes.
Though there are certain parliamentary traditions in terms of allowing for debate, in terms of having consultation with stakeholders, um, those principles weren't weren't adhered to in this
Yeah.
case.
So there wasn't even the
Uh,
pretense, right?
yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And I think they felt that given the timing, the situation, that farmers would not be able to do much. And if they did something, it would be basically at the state level.
Yes.
And the BJP felt very confident. Um, Maybe I'll give you a little bit of information on the BJP, just generally,
Please
if
do.
that's appropriate.
Please do.
So
There's a
the
lot of people
BJP,
who might not know
yeah,
that much about that party, and maybe even give us a tiny bit of background on Modi himself, Arvind.
I will try to give you a brief background. So the BJP is the full name is Bharatiya Janata Party, and their origins have been they go quite a ways back, but the current form of BJP started in the late 80s and into the 90s, and that was when Advani would go on his what were called Rath Yatras, and the basic focal point at that time was the issue of the Babri Masjid. I'm not sure if people are familiar with that, but there's a mosque located in UP in the city of Ayodhya, and there's some people, Hindus, who feel that it is the birthplace of Lord Rama. It's kind of mythological reference. There isn't any historical reference to it,
Yeah.
but that became the catalyst for starting what then becomes the template for the BJP in terms of using polarized politics, Hindu versus Muslims, and creating those kind of divisive issues has been what they've tried to use. It didn't work initially in the late 80s or even in the 90s under Advani. But then Modi starts out as um, the chief minister of the province of Gujarat, and Gujarat is very much a state that's very much into commerce, and so during when he was the chief minister, there was a massacre of Muslims in the state of Gujarat, and there's a long history behind that as well. Um, but that happened during the time that he was chief minister, and there were investigations into what happened. But basically, Modi was given a clean chit. Clean chit, basically, that nothing could be found implicating him with the riots. Although he's had ties with right-wing organizations such as the RSS, the Rashtriya Swayam Sevak Sangh, and that's basically the paramilitary kind of group that supports the BJP and that gives a lot of the local power to the BJP. And there's
So
other.
yeah, no, thanks, Arvind. This is really good. So would it be fair to say, and again, just for maybe sort of North American folks who don't know much about Indian politics, that the BJP, especially under Modi, that they're sort of embodying a similar kind of right wing populism that say
Yes,
maybe Trump has embodied in the States?
yes. The only difference I would say is in India, it has actually led to outright violence in terms of uh, a massacre of minorities. That under Trump, I mean, there were a lot of things that have occurred, but it didn't get to that level.
Yes.
The other part of it is that polarized politics does have an appeal among certain segments. And kind of getting back to farmers and tying it in, Modi was not receiving particular support at the national level. And the Gujarat massacres had kind of tarnished his brand, you could say. But then um, one of the key players, corporate players uh, from from the state of Gujarat, at a at a uh, meeting of businessmen, lent his support to Modi, and that's Adani. And Adani then, because of his support, basically changed the narrative on Modi in terms of um, it was then seen that Modi is the one that brought about transformation in Gujarat in terms of the economy, and that Gujarat has really emerged as a state in terms of economic growth, and a lot of that then was credited to Modi. And with that, he was able to come to the national level, and that created a certain, and of course, a lot of corporate support was there in terms of the BJP for their elections. So that kind of relationship is there. And then the other part is over time, Indian media has lost being independent in the sense that they tend to largely be controlled also by corporate houses, and many of them are also supporting these farm laws as well. So the media in India generally does not, uh, I'm talking about the mainstream media in India, does not tend to criticize the ruling BJP. So
Yes.
that's kind of the scenario under which the farmers found themselves. But the farm agitation started in Punjab. It was going on there for years before, um, and once these uh, most farmers call these laws black laws, just because of what they perceive their intent is. And another part of it is uh, uh, one of the laws does say that farmers can sell their land to to corporations. And many farmers fear that if the price of crops is reduced to such a level that their indebtedness becomes worse under these laws, that they could become landless. And then corporates would directly control um, farmland. So that's, I think, where the real fear lies, because a lot of farmers, um, they may not necessarily be economically um, uh, um, strong and prosperous, but land still allows them to have a sense of wealth and that sense of dignity. And that really resonated in Punjab first, but then it spread into neighboring states, Haryana, Rajasthan, Uttar Pradesh, Madhya Pradesh, and many of the other states also. And when it started, farmers started to say that they're going to move towards Delhi. And that became kind of you could say, a rallying call, that we're going to go to Delhi and let Modi know that these farms are not the gift that we want. So um, now when they were trying to get to Delhi, a lot of the highways were were blocked. Many of them were actually even bulldozed, like there were pits dug out.
Wow. And
There
this is
were
by the
barricades.
government. Arvind, this was done by the
Government.
government to prevent the farmers from
Yes.
advancing. Wow.
Well, some of it directly through police, other by state level governments, and
Gotcha.
those state level governments also have ruling BJP. Um, so that made it difficult for farmers to initially get through. But farmers, being tough and also used to having a lot of challenges, ran right through basically, and went through the blockades. There's even a picture that I recall where there's a elderly Sikh farmer who is about to be struck by a baton by a soldier as he's trying to join the protest. And that picture, I think, kind of captured the power dynamics of here's the hand of the government through the military and 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 uh, and police dealing a heavy hand on the farmers. And the
Yeah.
farmers are basically exercising their democratic right to protest.
Yes.
Um, and the farmers then, once they make it to Delhi after all of those challenges, they're not allowed to go into the city.
So, what time of year, Arvind, did they finally make it to Delhi? Because all this was unfolding late last year in the beginning. But when did the
Yes,
farmers actually make it? It was sometime this year, wasn't it?
yes, it was actually the year anniversary in I believe in November, at the end of November. So just a year ago in November is when the protests start in Delhi, and they start in various border areas, border um, camps, where so the farmers actually close some of the highways initially, and then they encamp around those areas.
Okay.
So there's many different areas. I think there's 5 or 6 border camps, and so to intimidate the farmers further, what the BJP tried to do was they cut off certain supplies. They cut off internet. They they basically blockaded these camps. They prevented supplies such as water, food from getting in, or at least made it very difficult. But one of the things farmers did was they brought a lot of their supplies with them. So whenever farmers came, they brought with them grain, they brought uh, 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 with them vegetables, fruits, whatever it is. Um, so in a way, the border camps became self-sufficient. And then a lot of the gurdwaras, the Sikh temples in Delhi, also created langar, and langar is kind of an institution of of free kitchen. But that concept then was expanded to include any kind of supplies, medical supplies, whether someone needed clothing, whether someone needed shoes, whatever it was.
Super.
There was a hunger for that.
Nice.
So the farmers kind of showed that they could be very self-reliant,
Yes.
but at the same time, there were a lot of difficulties because when it initially started, it was during the colder months. The winter there in the north, especially at night, can sometimes hover just above 0 degrees. And this is being out in the open. There's no heating or maybe electrical heaters were work provided by certain organizations such as CASA Aid. Um, so over the years, you've had more than 700 farmers that died.
Wow. That's
Um,
incredible, Arvind, because I had heard over 300, but it's over 700, and
over
I'm not disputing
700,
that at all. Unbelievable, eh? I mean, to
yes.
think about, yeah, to think about what people had to lay on the line in that struggle,
Mhm.
that's unbelievable. Wow.
And that kind of gives it a very human face. Sometimes we hear, farmers endured a lot of hardship,
Yeah.
but also many of them gave their lives as well
Yes.
to because to them it was um, basically they didn't see a future in these laws. Like it'll be a loss of everything they know. It would be a loss of their self-sufficiency. It would be a loss for the next generation in terms of being able to carry on farming, to be able to have kind of dignity, to be able to own land. So all of those concerns is what motivated them. And for many, it was kind of a do or die situation that either we sacrifice everything we have, we endure all the hardship, or we could never go back to our homes knowing that we failed.
Yes.
Um, and so I can there's a lot more to it that we can discuss in terms of all the things that happened over the year. But
Yeah, I want to let here. I want to get some more information out of you, but I just wanted at this point sort of say what really struck me, Arvind, is when you kind of set the table for what was going on in India politically at the time,
mm,
and I drew, and to a certain extent, it's a clumsy comparison with the United States because you're right, they're different countries, different cultures, different histories. But I
yes,
think that the common thread that I find is really quite interesting because it's not just happening in India, the United States, it's happening around the world. Is you have this alliance between an authoritarian
mhm,
nationalist politics and it's often on the fringe, but when it comes into the center of the political sphere is when it joins forces with big corporate power,
very
and
true.
it sounds like that's exactly what happened with Modi. It's like when
Yes,
it was Adani, you were saying,
yes, Adani, and
yeah.
there's other players. Ambani is another important a person, and they were basically looking, like, just to give you an example, Adani, Ambani, both of them have grown in terms of the wealth, just as Jeff Bezos and others have grown during
Yes.
the pandemic. Um, and one of the areas that was left that they weren't able to touch is 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 the agriculture sector. So
Interesting.
that became an area, if you can, because in a pandemic, people may not buy other supplies, but
Yes.
food is something that you need. So if you can
Definitely.
also be invested in food, then basically you've broadly diversified
Yes.
in
You're
terms of
right.
your
And
holdings.
and we're seeing other players get involved in this too. So, for instance, Bill Gates, his a growing part of his investment portfolio globally is buying up land, buying up productive, food producing land. And this isn't tinfoil hat stuff, folks. This isn't to say that Gates created the COVID to depopulate the world. It's none of that silliness, but
Factual based in reality
it
and
really is, and
facts.
it's because these global players, these massive multi-billionaires and whatnot, they're not stupid. They can see the writing on the wall that
Yes,
exactly as crises intensify and accelerate, that those sorts of fundamental human needs are captive markets, basically, right? And
exactly.
so
Yes,
if you can capture that captive market, I mean, you can basically print money.
yes.
So yeah, and so Arvind, I'm curious. So tell me how did things come to a head? So you're saying these laws are coming down the pipe. The Indian farmers see what they're going to do down the road. They're going to dismantle basically the ability of small farmers to support themselves. So they mobilize, they head towards Delhi, they fight through massive hardships, hundreds of people putting their lives on the line. What actually forced in the last, I think it was just like the last month or two, but it seems the government has caved. So maybe talk a little bit about that. How did that go down?
So I think there were a few different reasons for that. One was the government did try to polarize the farmer protests as well by dividing people along caste and especially religion. And during the protests, there was a lot of media attention given to the fact that Sikhs were very much involved in the protest. Mind you, this wasn't just a Sikh protest.
Yes.
It was many states involved, not just the Sikh majority state of Punjab. Um, and that's one of the things that they try to do. They try to frame it within that polarized lens that, you know, this is a Sikh community, Punjabi community, largely supporting it. And they try to labelize Sikhs as terrorists. They try to say that these are anti-nationalist elements supported by, at sometimes Pakistan, at other times it was said that China was
Wow.
supporting them. So there was various tactics that they tried to use. They also tried to use violence and intimidation. Um, so there were times where you had armed groups that said that they were local people, but they were actually people with links to right-wing organizations that went into protest sites, caused disruption, tore down tents, um, uh, hit people, all sorts of things. I think that was part of the intimidation. There was also a minister in the state of Uttar Pradesh, UP, that actually ran. His son actually ran over farmers in his SUV.
Wow.
Um, so that was another way to try to let farmers know, hey, look, if you don't behave, there can be repercussions.
Yeah.
But farmers throughout all of those intimidation tactics, cutting off supplies, for the most part, they remained very much committed to Gandhian principles in terms of being nonviolent, in
Wow.
terms of mobilizing at a large level, using civil disobedience tactics. Um, and so I think part of it was the resiliency and the stubbornness of farmers. The other part, and I think this may be the political calculation that finally persuaded the BJP. There are state elections coming up next year
Okay.
in various states, including the state of Uttar Pradesh that I've mentioned a few times, UP. UP has the ruling BJP. The chief minister is Yogi Adityanath, and he has the title yogi, but he's not really a yogi in the traditional sense of the word. He's much more of a right wing. I want to use a neutral word, um, but he uses a lot of polarized tactics. And within the state, there has been a lot of anti-Muslim, whipping up of anti-Muslim sentiment. Um, and So those state elections are critically important for the BJP because the BJP has always projected itself as a party that never loses elections. So during the farm protests, they were trying to break up the protesters, not have farmers from the state of Haryana, Haryana, Uttar Pradesh, Rajasthan, and other states join the farmers from Punjab, but that didn't succeed. And during the protests, actually, the farmers started to overcome a lot of the divisions around caste, around religion. And
Wow.
many farmers were actually apologizing to each other, including from the state of Uttar Pradesh, for a lot of things that have happened in the past.
Wow.
So and the leader from the farm leader from the UP, he was also instrumental in making sure that UP farmers stayed on course and knew what they were fighting for.
Super.
So because of those elections coming up, I think the calculation was this is something that we have to strategically draw
Mm,
at this time. But because of all that has transpired over the year, farmers do not have trust in the government.
yes.
They're still saying that we're not going back to our home states and to our farm until we have certain guarantees for the minimum support payment, guarantees that the Mandi system would be kept intact, guaranteed that their land will be protected.
Super.
So the farmers haven't backed down in that way. Um, but I suspect that the government strategy, I don't have evidence to this, but given how a lot of right-wing governments operate and how they tend to be aligned with kind of neoliberal policies, um, I think the idea is to kind of take away the laws now
Yeah.
before the elections. And then I suspect before the general election, after the general election, something similar may be introduced.
Yes.
It might be, you know, losing this battle, but still continuing strong for the long-term war by
Yeah,
the.
no, I think that's interesting analysis, Arvind, because I think you're right. Again, trying to draw larger parallels from what you've described transpiring in India, you really do get this sense that when big corporations and the politicians that are beholden to them, when they want something, they don't give it up easily. And and to take nothing away from the victory that the farmers have won, because it's incredible to push them back at all, right?
Yeah,
And
exactly.
they clearly have done that. To give them their full credit, that's amazing. And yet I think what you're suggesting is, and it's true, is that the struggle isn't over, you know?
Yes.
Yeah.
And
And
that's the
so,
other part. Like farmers have often been stereotyped as being ignorant or not being highly educated or not knowing things or not being technocrats or whatever word you want to use.
yes,
But they've proven that they understand the issue much better than anyone else.
yes,
And that's true of like when we often have so-called reforms even introduced in Europe and North America, Asia, or Latin America, or in other parts of the world. Similar tactics are used.
yes,
Um, and the whole idea is to persuade people um, by emotions. And even in India, using religion or caste as a way to create wedge
yes,
between people in North America. It can be race or certain other identity to create division between people so that you don't see um, what is really being taken away from the public interest.
yes,
And then people are kind of disunited at that point.
yeah,
And in that division, you can kind of roll through so-called reforms,
yes, yeah,
which in the end hurt everyone. They hurt the general population. And farmers also, they don't see this protest as just for them. It's also to protect average people because if the price of um, uh, uh, goods go up, that'll affect consumers. If this can be done within farming, similar reforms could be introduced in other sectors, which will
definitely.
harm those sectors as well. So the farmers saw this as kind of a global protest movement
Yes,
that whatever they do will have an impact globally,
yeah,
not just locally. And they also saw their struggle at a national level and at an international level.
wow.
And that's the other part. If you look at what happened to farming in North America, up until the 80s, it was very much the uh, the family farm to a large degree.
And we had a
And
wheat board too, right? We had a functioning
exactly
wheat
in
board.
Canada.
Yeah,
So as those things have been taken away, what we see in North America, I'm not so sure about Europe because we're not aware of that context. We have now corporate industrial farming, which
Yes.
has all sorts of harmful uh, uh, effects. And in India, it would have even further effect because 60% of people rely on farming directly.
Wow.
So you can't have all those people working at factories or whatever else you want to create
No,
as
that is
as a
60% of
reality.
a very large population, right? So
Yes,
yeah, yeah. One of the things, Arvind, and I'm actually thinking that, if I could get a little bit more of your time, I almost think this needs to be a bit of a two-parter, Arvind, because I think there is a whole other discussion around some things that you've just been able to sort of touch on because there's a lot of context to go through. But what I'd really like to get at is this idea that you have a situation where you describe that really a bunch of people had their direct material and political interests affected, right? And yet there was all these superficial ways to divide this group of people up. So these Indian farmers, right? Who has more money, who has less money, who's Sikh,
exactly.
who's Hindu, who's Muslim, all these
Mhm.
sorts of things, right? Different
Yes,
castes, like you're saying as well.
yes, exactly.
And it's a fascinating illustration of what always seems to happen when you have this essential conflict between working class people or farmers or whoever trying to just make a living and these corporate interests. Is the corporate interest will always try to divide, obviously,
In-
the farmers or the working people. And
Yes,
yet, if they succeed, then they win. Usually, then
exactly.
they scatter the protests. But it sounds like what's so fascinating about what the Indian farmers were able to do, and it really speaks to sort of like old school. This is the sort of mentality of the labor movement. It's the mentality of the farmers unions that were cropping up all across, definitely all
Mhm.
across North America at the turn of last century. Is to realize that through their common cause and their common interests, that people have power and they can
Yes,
stand up against these sorts of corporate forces. And I think the Indian farmers have proven that all over again.
yes. And that's, I think, the positive that we can take away from it. Oftentimes when we have corporate agenda or something being introduced, it's as if this is a given. There's nothing we can do. Um,
Yes.
and I think the farmers give a really great example of if you're united against it, if you understand what are the interests, the power interests behind it, and how this will really actually erode your own power and interests.
Yes.
And if you stay united against it, no matter how strong the ruling power is, it cannot really really suppress you. And I think that's what the farmers have proven. And that isn't to say that there won't be further attempts in the future. There likely would be,
Yes.
but I think showing the resiliency of the farmer, anyone trying it again, um, would be quite foolish. And I think they'll kind of realize that farmers are are very astute. They can organize, they can defend their interests, they can mobilize, and those are the things that I think the labor unions have always done. And that's something that the farmer unions have shown, that they have a way to lead, and the leadership has the respect of farmers, and they also have their unity among themselves. And there were various attempts to disrupt the unions and such, but none of them succeeded because the farmer unions were always very clear in terms of what was going on. And I think this may sound kind of naive, but when truth is on your side and when you understand that no matter what the lies are being spread in the media and through various other channels supported by the government or channels that back the government, um, you will still prevail. But you have to keep that fortitude and that unity.
Yes.
Um, and I think other labor unions, other protest movements can take a lot from this
Yeah.
in terms of tactics, in terms of planning, in terms of also the idealism that you have to stay committed.
Yes.
So those are, and that's why the protest, although they occurred in India, and for anyone living outside of India, they may seem kind of distant, but they have an impact on us as well, because a lot of those issues resonate globally,
Definitely.
and then there's nothing that's local,
Yeah.
and India is also a major country in terms of what happens in the agriculture sector. There will have implications across the world. So
Definitely.
those are things that we need to keep in mind as well.
Yeah, and I like what you said about, you're right, there are global implications, and I'd say for a number of reasons. First of all, India is the largest democracy on the planet. It's an incredibly important country, actually, just because folks in North America don't know much about what's going on there. It's very important, and I think, I mean, two of my favorite writers on globalization, Arundhati Roy and Vandana Shiva, are people, obviously they're both Indian, and they took what was happening there and they linked it to the global context, whether it was neoliberalism, or with Vandana Shiva, whether it was genetically modified seeds and the corporate control of agriculture that you're talking about. And so these things really are interconnected. And so I think that in analyzing a situation like the farmers' protest, we see commonalities in terms of the forces we're struggling against, basically oligarchic, control over our environments, our economies, our future. And we also see, a commonality in the forces pushing back, regular people, right? Trying to secure their own livelihood, a future for their children, that sort of thing. So I do think there's very important universal lessons to be taken.
Yes.
And so that's on that note, I would really like to, you're a busy man, Mr. Singh, but I would like to corral some of your time again. And maybe we can dive into a little bit more, because I know full disclosure, folks, Arvind and I have known each other for a lot of years, and we love to talk about politics.
Yes,
So maybe we can get into some more of the lessons,
yes,
strategic and political, and even dare I say, when we talk about unity, even the spiritual implications of this kind of struggle.
and that's very important. Like here we kind of touched on the surface in many areas, but I wanted to kind of give a general background.
Yes.
But it'll be really good to kind of get more into looking at the wider implications, and that's something that I would love to do. And I think it's important for people to be aware of it as well.
Yes, that's awesome. Listen, Arvind, thank you so much. And just to keep this one bite-sized, I think it's maybe a good time to wrap up now, but I will 100% be in touch, and let's set up that second conversation, man, because I think it's needed.
Excellent. Look forward to it.
Awesome. Take care, Arvind.
Bye, Kevin.